Coming up next, our interview with Christian McEachern, veteran in the Canadian Armed Forces.
We were handed Mefloquine. It was one of the things we had to start taking every day for what we call the road dose. First night I took the drug, horrific nightmares. The second day I was taking the drug, I started feeling nauseous, like I was going to be sick after I took the pill. By day 3, I was having full-blown panic attacks.
So, you return home. What's that like? I mean, because you weren't living with your family anymore. You were in Calgary. Did you have a girlfriend waiting for you? Did you?
No, actually,
What was? You knew I was going to touch that subject.
I had a girlfriend when I left for Yugoslavia, and I didn't have one when I came home. I came home for my 2-week leave in the middle of the tour that everybody gets. Well, not everybody gets it at the middle of the tour, obviously, but during the 6 months, you get 2 weeks, and you can either fly your significant other to Europe to meet you, or you can fly home and meet your girlfriend. And my girlfriend at the time had a job, so she couldn't, fly to me in Europe for 2 weeks or whatever. So I talked to her in Zagreb on the phone because I was coming home, and literally my buddies were saying, "Christian, why are you going home? You should be coming with us to the Greek islands. We're all going to party, have a good time." And I was like, "No, I'm going to be the good boyfriend. I'm going to go home. I'm going to see my girlfriend." Talked to her on the phone. Everything was happy, hunky-dory. Line at the airport in Calgary. No girlfriend, just my brother standing there to meet me, and he's got a letter from my girlfriend saying she doesn't want to see me anymore. Literally, the first words out of my mouth were, "Fucking bitch, I should be in Greece right now."
Cyprus.
It's Greek islands.
No.
Mykonos and all those places. So, I think that's the name of it. It's been a while since I've talked about it. Anyways, so no, I didn't have a girlfriend when I came home. And actually ended up having...
How long had you been absent at that point? Sorry, how long had you been absent at that point?
Absent?
Well,
I don't know, maybe about 4 months by that point. So, quite common in the military. It happened to me multiple times with different girlfriends. Come home to an empty apartment, all my bills unpaid, money stolen. It's a sad story that probably 70% of Army guys have to tell. So there's even the Dear John letter, so it's not like it's an uncommon or a strange thing.
No.
I guess looking back in hindsight, I never really thought about it before, but being away for us for 6 months, that 6 months actually goes pretty quick because you're so busy and there's so much going on that you don't really have time to sit down and think about home. You do, but you're busy. The next thing you know, it's over. But to a person at home in their regular life, that'd be like watching the second hand on the clock for 6 months straight. Tick, tick, tick. So it's probably a completely different experience for a spouse or a girlfriend at home waiting. They have no idea what you're doing, if you're in danger, and then of course there's the legendary party stories. So I was a good boy. I never cheated on my girlfriend, but lots of guys did. So it creates that lack of trust or whatever. But so I guess in hindsight, I don't necessarily blame them. We were all young. I was gone a lot. I think at one point the longest I'd spent in Canada was 2 weeks. And then I was either on courses, training, overseas, you name it. If you were single, you were definitely never around. So, had trouble adjusting when I got home. I got in trouble with one of my brothers, actually. I won't get too much into the details. Bit of a misunderstanding, but I literally just come home from a war zone to a brother that deserved to be punched.
Okay.
He'd done something, and No, I had trouble adjusting from home. Had a bit of a quicker temper, little more on edge. Um,
You described this to me before in that being vigilant, hyper vigilant, when you were on tour kept you
yeah,
alive, right? So that's something that became your new norm out there, and then you come back here and there's no use for that for the
yeah.
most part, right?
Um, with
And
everything, probably the biggest thing I noticed when I came home is because everything was landmined in Yugoslavia. You had to either know that the area had been previously cleared or physically had seen, wildlife or people walking in the area that you were in. So I couldn't walk across the lawn for a long time. Um, just instinct. It was
wow.
just everything in my body. Or, my brother would, come home and cut across the lawn to the front door, and my heart would be like, oh, holy crap, and then I'd be like, oh shit, I'm at home, right? Um, didn't necessarily
How long did
have
that take you to adjust to?
flashbacks. I didn't hear a car backfire and dive into the bushes or anything, but you're definitely a lot more aware of stuff. And when you're in those situations, in a combat tactical situation, a combat leader is trained to constantly assess the next the next bound. So we call it tactical bound, sort of one piece of obvious ground to the next. So you're on top of a hill, working your way to the next hill, down the valley, across the valley, up to the top of the next hill. Very simplifying it for you. But during that process, every where every every 100 meters, you're literally assessing the environment for dangers. So if I get attacked from over here, what am I going to do? I'm going to go over here. No, wait, I better not go over there because that guy that attacked me here probably planned for me to run over here and he's got a booby trap over here. So I better not go over there. So I have to go over here, which might be safe because he didn't think about it. But that resets every 100 meters. So you're constantly contingency planning as you're advancing on that ground. So you're basically always ready for something to happen. You get a good idea about where stuff's going to come from, where the shots are going to happen, and the best places to do those things. Now, obviously, nothing's predictable, and that theory can be thrown out the window completely. But the moral of the story is a soldiers can constantly train to assess the situation in front of them and plan for shit hitting the fan. That's hard to undo when you get home. So, the first night you wake up and you roll out of bed and you don't have your rifle beside you, you know, if you don't have your rifle beside you in the army, that's the end of the world. That's like that rifle has to be with you at all times. So you wake up, you roll over, and you can't find your rifle. Next thing you know, you're panicking because where's my gear? You haven't been home for very long. There might be, 6 months of extreme stress and a lack of sleep. Um, you tend to be a bit groggy the first while when you're back home getting your first night's sleep in a bed where there are people shooting around you. Um, so it's an adjustment. There's no doubt about it. And I think that's where I was already starting to not relate to my family. I came home differently from Croatia, um, maybe a bit more grown up, definitely not as innocent. Um, and I think it made it hard for me to relate to my family afterwards. And it just kind of got worse as time went on.
Now, knowing that that would be a common thing for the people in charge in the army, was there any services at all to help you prepare for the return home
The
at
only
all, or were you
thing,
just
this is
like, "Here
back
you go, thanks for
before
your service"?
post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized. We were sitting in a bombed out building. Most of us hadn't showered in 2 weeks. We looked like we just crawled out of the jungle in Vietnam. As tough of a group of guys as you can, imagine. Just mean and dirty. And the medic was in front of us and he asked us, does anybody have any problems with what we've seen or done over here? And of course, nobody's going to say anything. And that was the extent of the screening that we got. 2 days later, we were home. So,
To your knowledge, things have changed now with the recognition of PTSD.
yes, But now we're getting into the problem with Mefloquine and misdiagnosis.
How long between the end of your tour in Croatia and you being called out for
About a
Congo?
year and a half. I would say, looking back in hindsight, I had mild post-traumatic stress disorder after Croatia, some mild depression, started drinking a little bit more. Wasn't anything anybody else wasn't doing, so it didn't strike anybody as weird or anything like that.
By the time a year had passed, do you feel you had somewhat
Oh yeah,
adapted
no, I had
though
adapted.
to life
You
back?
know,
Yeah.
I was new in my unit after Yugoslavia, so I had that whole year and a half was proving myself again, which I did. I started getting all the fancy courses. My career was totally taking off. Things were going well. Maybe not necessarily great on the home front, but as a soldier in a career, um, it was definitely moving in the direction I wanted it to. And then Africa happened. Tuesday morning, one day, we got pulled into the office and told we'd been handpicked as the 10 guys going over as reconnaissance for op assurance to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zaire, which is now Democratic Republic of Congo, and was told I'd be there by Saturday. So I remember the guy giving us the briefing for that was Joint Task Force, which is the highest level commando you can get in Canada. The guy was crying when he was talking to us. He just got back from Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda.
Oh,
Not crying,
was
but
he
you
leaving
you
with
could
you?
see his eyes tearing. He was trying to hide it, but it was pretty obvious.
Yeah.
And I remember after that meeting, the 10 of us were standing around in a group. 7 of them were brand new guys, had never been anywhere, and 3 of us had been in Yugoslavia. And my boss actually said, "Is anybody nervous about this?" And the only 3 people to stick their hands up were the 3 of us that had been in Yugoslavia. And the other guys were so full of piss and vinegar that they were like, "Yeah, rah," just like we were before Croatia. Um, so that's when they gave us all our drugs for Africa. We call it a DAG, Deployment Assistance Group. And you basically go around to about 20 different tables, everything from signing your will, seeing the chaplain, getting your shots, getting your dental cleared, making sure all your administration's good to go, all that kind of stuff, making sure you're deployable. And we were handed Mefloquine as one of the things we had to start taking every day for what we call the load dose. First night I took the drug, horrific nightmares. The second day I was taking the drug, I started feeling nauseous, like I was going to be sick after I took the pill. By day 3, I was having full-blown panic attacks. I'd never had a panic attack in my life. I'd been under fire by this point. I was a mountain climber, total adrenaline junkie. All of a sudden, I'm on a plane going to Africa, and I had a full-blown panic attack for the entire 36 hours I was on that flight. No idea what was happening to me. It kind of subsided once I got on the ground in Africa, but it quickly started turning into aggression.
There was no at that point you hadn't put the two together, and they didn't give you any
They
warning,
never,
tell you about some
they,
signs to watch for and stuff
nothing.
like that.
All they said is you might have some
Nothing.
funky nightmares. That's a normal side effect of the drug. They never said if you have panic attacks, hallucinations, forgetfulness, suicidal ideations, homicidal ideations, etc., 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 you're supposed to immediately discontinue use of the drug because it's eating your brain tissue. Never told us any of that. And in fact, I may have been found with the proper screening that they were supposed to do with an interview with the doctor for eligibility for Mefloquine. They would have determined I had mild post-traumatic stress disorder from Croatia and also an undiagnosed traumatic brain injury from an armored vehicle accident a year before. And that would have made me ineligible to take the Mefloquine. So they never told us anything about those symptoms, that we had to stop the drug if we were taking it, and that those were happening. And quite literally, up to this point, nobody had ever explained to me what a panic attack. I mean, you can tell somebody what a panic attack is, but to a guy that's an adrenaline junkie whose entire existence has been around pushing the limits, what's a panic attack? You know, it's something you read in a book. You don't know what's actually happening to you at the time. I thought maybe I was going to have a heart attack, you know. So throughout that tour, I started having, I can remember most of everything in Croatia to the detail perfectly. There are some nights in Africa, I'm not even sure what was real anymore with this drug. You know, 20 years of horrific nightmares. You know, I've talked about this with my shrink lately about where did the actual trauma stop that we witnessed and the dreams start. That's how bad the dreams are.
But the nightmares were
Oh,
nightly.
nightly, but and I mean, looking back in hindsight, I actually, the last time I ever slept without a drug or alcohol was before I took Mefloquine. So while we were in Africa, I noticed I was having trouble starting to sleep. So we started drinking in order to get to sleep. Um, may not have attributed it to that at the time, but I mean, 20 years later, and you can kind of look back at the big picture and think, you know, I was suffering from these side effects: insomnia, the hallucinations, the aggression, the panic attacks. I had almost every one of the side effects that they were telling us, or warning, that they should have warned us about. So, um,
Well, if you want to just pause there for the listeners, I'm just going to go through Mefloquine information, um, just taken off Wikipedia here, saving the trip down to Google. So Mefloquine, sold under the brand name Lariam, and amongst others, is a medication used to prevent or treat malaria. When used for the prevention, it is typically started before potential exposure and continued for several weeks after potential exposure. It can be used to treat mild or moderate malaria, but it is not recommended for severe malaria. It is taken by mouth. Serious side effects include potential long-term mental health problems such as depression, hallucinations, anxiety, neurological side effects such as poor balance, seizures, ringing in the ears. It is therefore not recommended in people with a history of mental health problems or epilepsy. Common side effects include vomiting, diarrhea, headaches, and a rash. It appears to be safe during pregnancy and breastfeeding. Not something I would recommend for my wife, but I guess we'll stay out of malaria-infested countries if she ever gets pregnant again. In 2013, the United States Food and Drug Administration added a boxed warning to the U.S. label of Mefloquine regarding the potential for neuropsychiatric side effects that may persist even after discontinuation administration of the drug. Psychiatric effects include nightmares, visual and auditory hallucinations, anxiety, depression, unusual behavior, and suicidal ideation, amongst others. Neurological effects include dizziness, loss of balance, and tinnitus, which is the ringing in the ear. Central nervous system events that require hospitalization occur in about 1 in 10,000 people taking mefloquine. These are the official stats. We can certainly talk about that. And I've read reports that in the army, and probably based on the fact that they just kept you on it for so long after the initial symptoms, uh, they were talking about close to
yeah,
40%, which is drastically different than 1 in 10,000. With milder events, dizziness, headaches, insomnia, and vivid dreams. In up to 25%, when some measure of subjective severity is applied to the rating of adverse events, about 11 to 17% of travelers are incapacitated to some degree. And then
So let's put this into a bit of
shall we go into
context.
this?
In Guantanamo Bay, where the terrorists were brought after 9/11 that they got out of Afghanistan and Iraq, quite often prior to torture sessions, they were administered 1,250 milligrams of Mefloquine for the hallucination effect, to make the torture more effective, basically, to make it worse. I deployed to Africa with 1,000 milligrams in my system. I was practically drooling out the side of my mouth. I had a 9mm pistol, a tactical shotgun, a C7 with the night vision scope laser combination on it for shooting targets in the dark, and I was a drooling retard. This is how we deployed. Now, there's no benefit to load dosing Mefloquine. In fact, Mefloquine has been said to not load dose it because of its neurotoxic potential, but my tour was low dose. Out of my tour, there was 3,000 guys that were low dosed. 3,000 guys that were low dosed. Only about 250 of us actually made it over to the country before the mission was canceled in a couple of months. So there are literally thousands of guys in Canada that never left the country and saw a war, that have post-traumatic stress disorder that they were diagnosed with, and the only denominator is that they were low dosed with Mefloquine. Here's the kicker. It takes 7 weeks for Mefloquine in your system in order to become an effective prophylactic against, that's what it's called anyways, prophylaxis against malaria.
How many weeks did you have before leaving
What's
when you
that?
started it? How many weeks did they give you to start it before they shut
Well,
out?
I took 1,000 milligrams of Mefloquine the first week. I left the country on week 9. So essentially, I was unprotected from malaria for most of the time I was in Africa, even though I'd been given an anti-malaria drug. So I got sick for nothing. Most of us are poisoned for nothing. Most of the guys in Afghanistan, there wasn't a mosquito. They were in the desert. They were on Mefloquine. Basically, and we'll talk about this later on in the interview with this lawsuit, but the Canadian Army could not have been any more negligent or unethical in how they administered this drug. And not only that, has left us to our own devices to try and figure out what's going on, and continually deny that this stuff is happening. The suicide epidemic in Canada is 95% Mefloquine. It's got nothing to do with post-traumatic stress disorder. It's time to hold the government accountable. They're killing soldiers. We have a higher casualty rate now from suicide from Afghanistan than we do from people that were actually killed in theater during the war. That's Veteran Affairs, and that's the Department of National Defense. That is not the Taliban.
What can you tell us of the Somalia that was preceding the Congo mission?
Well, I wasn't there, so I can't specifically verify any details. I have some close friends that were there, and there was a lot of stuff that happened in Somalia that should have come out in the Somalia inquiry, but the inquiry was cut short a week before the Mefloquine testimonies were due to come out, and that's when we start sticking on the tinfoil hat, Liberal Party donations, Mefloquine getting into circulation with the public. Basically, a lot of people spent a lot of money to get Mefloquine into circulation, and when they found out it was a bad drug, I don't think they could pull out of it. There was too much momentum with the drug, the way that stuff gets approved. Guys were wandering around the compounds at night naked with their guns, not knowing where they were, what they were doing, wanting to shoot people. I've heard multiple reports of soldiers that were having dreams they were committing suicide to only find out they were really doing it. For instance, you're in your bunk across from your buddy who's sleeping, and all of a sudden your buddy who's sleeping gets up, cocks, puts a magazine on his rifle, cocks it, put to his mouth, and pull the trigger, except for that you stop him before he pulls the trigger. The guy wakes up and thinks it was just a dream, but in fact, he was actually doing it for real. I've heard that a number of times from different people that happened to them. There was guys that had to be locked up and caged because they were totally losing it and going to shoot somebody with their rifle. The commanding officer, Mateau, apparently one night was found outside the compound talking incoherently, waving his pistol around on a Mefloquine night. This drug should not be given to people that have guns in combat zones. Period. It's the most inappropriate drug you could imagine to give a soldier. It's already bad enough, let alone have hallucinations and all that kind of crap added in. We're put into situations where not only are we responsible for our lives and the lives of the people we're leading, we're responsible for the civilians that we're there to protect. And we weren't making the best of decisions because we were totally impaired. I mean, I remember Mefloquine nights that I had to go out on patrol. I literally felt like I was drilling out the side of my mouth on some sort of drug-induced teenage trip, 13 years old or 14 years old, drunk on drugs at the party at a rave kind of thing. I don't know, whatever, but it was not good.
And the 40% statistic resonates with your experience.
Well, everybody had nightmares. I don't think there was anybody that didn't have nightmares. Now, whether we can't...
Everyone had problems sleeping to start.
We can't tell you why it affects some
people
people differently than others. That's all stuff that's got to be researched and how that happens or why. There's some speculation with previous brain injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, mental illness kind of stuff that would be bad for Mefloquine, but that's as far as we can go. But they knew this drug was bad in Somalia, and they should have killed that drug right there on the spot. Period. Done. And it didn't. It got put into full circulation after that. Now, what I can tell you about night that kid was killed in the bunker by Clayton Matchey, and it's important to say that none of us condone what happened. It was horrible. It was wrong on so many levels. And we can get into Clayton Matchey wasn't a good person before Mefloquine. That's not what I don't want to discuss that. That's getting into some deep stuff. What we need to know, though, is that before that kid was killed, he was witnessed beating invisible camels. He was hallucinating. He was having a total psychotic hallucination attack before he killed that kid. And he thought the kid was covered in invisible camel spiders. So Buddy comes into the bunker, what the fuck's going on? And he's running around with a pickaxe, the wooden handle for a pickaxe, with no pickaxe on it. And he's smashing the sandbags around the room because he thinks there's spiders in there. Right? Now, does that not deserve some attention, investigation? We're not saying what he did was right. We're not saying he wasn't a good person or that he was a good person. We're not saying any of that. All we're asking, and we're not asking for forgiveness. All we're asking is that hasn't there been enough stuff happen that we deserve to have this looked at seriously?
I'm just going to read the officialese on the Somalia affair, just to bring anyone listening up to speed here. The Somalia affair was a 1993 military scandal. It peaked with the beating to death of a Somali teenager at the hands of 2 Canadian soldiers participating in humanitarian efforts in Somalia. The act was documented by photos and brought to light internal problems in the Canadian Airborne Regiment. Military leadership were sharply rebuked after a CBC reporter received altered documents, leading to allegations of a cover-up. Eventually, a public inquiry was called. Despite being controversially cut short by the government, the Somalia inquiry cited problems in the leadership of the Canadian forces. The affair led to the disbanding of the Canadian elite Canadian Airborne Regiment, greatly damaging the morale of the Canadian forces and marring the domestic and international reputation of Canadian soldiers. It also led to the immediate reduction of the Canadian military spending by nearly 25% from the time of the killing to the inquiry. So that's the official Wikipedia on the Somalia affair. Um, and then I have a question for you. You're a bunch of guys, you're all having nightmares. How much is that talked about while you guys are together in the field? Is that something that most of you keep to
Oh no, we used
yourself,
to the
or
morning after we took Mefloquine, used to literally it was a competition to see who had the more messed up nightmare the night before.
so
Oh,
it
it
was
was
well
totally well known.
known
It was a joke.
that
We didn't.
yeah,
I mean, looking
including the
back on it
officers
now, it
knew?
wasn't a joke. It was eating our brain. But at the time,
Oh
you
no,
know,
yeah.
it was all ha ha ha, just another thing the army did to us. You know, it's Mefloquine crazy night. You know,
And was that would you say just amongst the lower ranks or the officers as
well, I don't know
well, and
what went on
everybody
at
was
the
in
upper
on it?
level. I mean, there is officers. There is officers that are a part of the lawsuit that did get affected. I mean, it didn't matter whether you were an officer, an NCO, mental injury, no mental injury.
No, they would have been taking it as well, and they would have been in the know though, and they would have been they would have known that you guys were talking
Yeah, but
about
I
it,
don't think
and
anybody
that
put
it was out
anything
in the
to it. Because,
open.
for instance, my platoon commander in Africa, I'd worked with him for almost 2 years, and he'd known me as an aggressive guy that you could count on when shit hit the fan. I mean, you worked with me, you know what I'm like. Um, and within 6 months of me taking Mefloquine, my career was completely falling apart. Not one fucking person asked me or bothered to ask what has happened. You know, how does a person go from being a top prospect to being a complete fucking basket case in 6 months? How does that happen? You know, and I started drinking more because I didn't know what was happening to me. I wasn't sleeping. I was having horrific nightmares. Back in Canada, I was waking up with sleep paralysis where I was conscious but I couldn't move my body, which would create panic attacks. I was waking up, I didn't know where I was. I was teaching a recruit course in Wainwright, and we'd come back off a full night patrol, and I basically had about half an hour that I could grab a nap before everything started up again. So I don't know, it was 4:30 in the morning, and I'm sleeping on my pack, and I have a total hardcore nightmare. When I woke up, I couldn't have told you what country I was in, where I was, what I was doing, but I was on the ground in a assault fire in a prone firing position on my pack, totally ready to go. Um, and I remember coming to and looking over, kind of like, what the hell's going on? And my recruits are looking at me like, what the fuck? Are you okay? I was totally drenched in sweat. No idea where I was. Couldn't have told you whether I was in Croatia, Congo, Canada, whatever. Um, and so I started drinking more. You know, and the drinking got out of control because I didn't know what was going on. I was having crying spells. I mean, the list of stuff that was happening was all horrible. And I basically lasted for about 6 or 7 months before I finally crawled into a hospital thinking I was having a heart attack. Because at this point, I still don't know what a panic attack is. Um, and so they tested me for all the heart stuff for that. And while I was in the waiting room, there was a pamphlet. You know, you got the wall of pamphlets with, don't drink while you're pregnant, and do you have COPD? You know, all the information brochures. And there was one on post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'd never heard anything about it before. And I don't know what made me pick it up and read it, but I was reading it, and I was like, holy shit, this sounds like almost everything that I have happening with my body right now. The insomnia, the nightmares, the triggers, the flashbacks, all that kind of stuff. And when the doctor came back with the test results and said, your heart's fine, there's nothing wrong with you. And I was like, well, then what the hell's going on? And he asked me, have you ever been deployed anywhere before? And I kind of laughed, like, yeah, okay, sure. What's that got to do with anything? Um, and then he started talking about it, and then I mentioned the pamphlet that I'd read out in the thing, and that some of the symptoms that I'd read with this post-traumatic stress disorder, and was that a possibility that that's what I've got? And that's kind of how I ended up getting diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. The military psychiatrist that saw me within 5 minutes was like, yeah, you're fucked. Excuse my language, but and then of course I was angry at him. Like, no, I'm not. I don't have PTSD. What are you talking about? I'm fine. Um, he did at the time mention that he thought it was a methylquine toxicity issue, but he said that because Veteran Affairs and the Department of National Defense don't recognize methylquine toxicity, that we run with PTSD because I literally could have PTSD too. I had seen enough stuff to justify that classification, I guess. But it wasn't adding up.
At
It
the
wasn't
time,
adding up to the level of PTSD that I had with what I've seen. I mean, I've been in some shitty places, but by no means have I been in a horrible, terrible. My life is in. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that. I haven't been in as bad of situations as combat can get, so I shouldn't have as hardcore symptoms that I was having. Now that doesn't mean I didn't see stuff and couldn't have it, but it just didn't make any sense. So for 20 years, I've been on antidepressants, sleeping medication, antipsychotic medication, and then there's all the chronic pain stuff because I'm all beat up from being a soldier. So the Tylenol 3s, Tylenol 4s, morphine, again, fentanyl, OxyContin, all that kind of stuff. So for 20 years, I was basically taking about 25 pills a day between all of them. Some days a little bit more if I was in more pain. And for 20 years, I had all these side effects, things that I thought were just the pills. So come to about 3 years ago, my liver's failing, my kidneys are failing, I'm taking way too many pills, it's killing me. I'm consistently overweight, all the side effects I can't, the overweight was part of the side effect from the pills. It's killing me. I got to get off the pills. So I switched medical cannabis. And it took me almost a year and a half to get off the pills, clear of those side effects. Don't get me started on the medical marijuana cuts by Veteran Affairs. That's a whole nother story. But they basically cut my medical marijuana off in the middle of the most horrific part of the withdrawal symptoms from the pills. So they basically left me hanging at the worst time trying to come off these pills. But once I got clear of the pills and the side effects from the pills, there was a whole bunch of stuff that I thought was side effects from the pills that weren't the pills anymore. Vertigo, dizziness, gastrointestinal issues, loud ringing in the ears, dizziness, vertigo, abnormal anxiety, catastrophic thinking, all those.
and that was a continuation of symptoms
There
you
was a
had, or
continuation, but
did
the
that come
pills
out?
did camouflage a lot of it. Like my anxiety was never as bad because I was literally a zombie on the antidepressants, right?
Yeah.
So I couldn't feel anything because of the drugs. So I think it either masked the side effects or it camouflaged them, like in a sense that it hid them, for instance. So when you knew me, I was on all those antidepressants and stuff like that, and I was functioning fine, being an adrenaline guy kind of thing, going down the river. And I think once I got off the pills and I didn't have that chemical buffer anymore, I've had to learn to manage all my symptoms. The anxiety skyrocketed since I got off the pills. Catastrophic thinking, a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'm having these attacks where I start to get dizziness, vertigo, and then it turns into excessive sweating, like sweating to the point where there's a pool of water on the floor underneath me when I'm standing there talking to you. And then that turns into bone crushing, like hyperthermia level shiver, like hardcore. And I'm wearing 20 blankets and I can't get warm. And I can't figure this out. This isn't post-traumatic stress disorder. This isn't the side effects from the pills. But it's something that started happening once I got off the pills. So I'm talking to a friend of mine just casually who's gone through the mefloquine toxicity process already. And he's like, dude, you're having temporal lobe seizures. And that's a mefloquine thing. So I was like, okay, all right. I've long suspected mefloquine as a big part of what my issues are. But once he explained to me everything that was going on, how the mefloquine affects the brain, and how that in turn affects the regulatory system of the human body, all those issues, sleeping, gastrointestinal, those are all controlled by your dorsal vagal kind of hippocampus area, which are the two known areas affected by mefloquine. And now we figured out that basically it creates a permanent inflammation of the brain, and that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, the chronic anxiety, tendinitis, all that kind of stuff, is actually inflammation of the brain. And the reason why we're starting to figure that out is because